Hello, everyone. I'm on it's George Washington's birthday, so I'm on a George Washington marathon. I've already had my shot of Washington rye whiskey. It's only for celebration. This is Washington's Mount Vernon has a seriously twisted history. Let's go.
Features the Washington family tomb, presidential artifacts,
Sorry, it started before I started recording. Okay, let's try this again. And take two, go.
Mount Vernon is the former home and plantation of the first president of the United States, George Washington, located in Virginia. Spanning 8,000 acres, Mount Vernon features the Washington family tomb, presidential artifacts, alleged ghosts, and a memorial to slaves. Mount Vernon sits on indigenous lands and was granted to Washington's grandfather John back in 1674 by colonial governor Lord Culpeper. At the time, some 15 indigenous tribes were living in Virginia. By the late 1700s, however, many of them were forced to give up their lands to the United States government. Not until President George H.W. Bush's designation of National American Indian Heritage Month in 1990 did states begin looking harder at America's indigenous history. Beginning in 2016, Virginia State Delegate Paul Kris recognized 11 of Virginia's tribes of people and how important they were to the state's history. Then, in 2019, high school students Dominic Anderson and Jared Phillips discovered a 6,000-year-old Native American axe at Mount Vernon during an archaeological dig. Archaeological curator Sean Devlin commented that artifacts such as this are a vital resource for helping us learn about the diverse communities who shaped this landscape throughout its long history. Mount Vernon spanned an amazing 8,000 acres when Washington inherited the property in 1761. 4 expansive gardens, 5 farms, and the mansion were maintained by over 300 enslaved people. True to slave ownership of the time, field slaves received only 2 sets of clothing and 1 pair of shoes per year. Those who worked within the home wore better clothes, but all were forced to live in simple barracks or one-room cabins with no insulation and only a blanket to stay warm. Like all slave owners of the day, George Washington could resort to cruel means of punishment. He approved of whipping when he felt it was warranted, or even selling his enslaved workers if they attempted to escape. Punishments were meted out to those who broke too many tools.
To be fair, not to be fair, but he sold one who repeatedly ran away. I don't remember the slave's name. He sold him, though, to a sugar plantation in the Caribbean. Safe to say they needed a lot of slaves down there because they worked them basically to death, like months. So that was a shit thing. But I think he only did that to 1. I could be wrong, but I know he did it to 1.
Worked too slowly or stole food.
And 1 is too many. Yes, I agree.
Roughly 47 slaves made escape attempts, some in large groups. In 1983, the official slave memorial was installed in the cemetery once used for Mount Vernon's enslaved people. There, some 50 to 100 of Washington's slaves are buried. Nobody seems sure of the exact count due to the number of unmarked graves, but elsewhere on the grounds are at least 6 buildings dedicated to the hundreds of enslaved laborers who toiled at Mount Vernon. Notably, there is a wreath-laying presentation almost daily. George Washington was raised to believe slavery was acceptable and owned 10 enslaved workers by age 11. But at the very least, as a plantation owner, Washington recognized marriages between slaves and prevented separating couples when he could. He also gave them holiday time off. However, there is overwhelming evidence that Washington did separate his enslaved workers from their families. He eventually grew uncomfortable with the idea of owning human beings, but didn't free any of his slaves during his lifetime, stipulating instead in his will that they would be freed after his wife's death. Still, Washington did come to accept the awfulness and inhumanity inherent in slavery, and
he did free Billy Lee, his manservant, who by then had 2 broken kneecaps and didn't get around well.
And his conscience aided him for most of his life after the end of the American.
There's Billy Lee represented in the painting. And of course, I'll always say it, that's James Monroe, future 5th president, represented there. And I've heard that this is supposed to be Davy Crockett. I could be wrong.
Revolution. William Lee, George Washington's personal valet, was the only slave emancipated immediately upon the death of the former president. Martha Washington, however, freed the rest of her husband's enslaved workers a year later. Despite freeing George's slaves, Martha willed her own enslaved workers to her children from her first marriage. Washington.
Okay. She did, but it was I think it's called a dower system, where she inherited the slaves because of her husband, John Parks Custis. I could be wrong on the name, but they were his slaves. He died. She inherited them, and is it a dower system or dowry system? Anyways, she had control of the slaves until the children were of legal age to take over. So basically, she was just the steward of those slaves. So she did not have the legal right to free those slaves because they technically transferred from the husband to the kids. She had control of them. She had no legal recourse to allow them to be set free because they weren't technically her property. It was like they were borrowed. And I'm not saying I'm just trying to explain that it's unfair to say that she didn't free them. She legally was not allowed to. If she would have tried to, they would have been like, no, it's not how it works. And she could have been held and charged with, basically stealing from her children because they were technically going to be theirs. I said technically a couple times there.
Washington's descendants continued to keep slaves at Mount Vernon until the Civil War. In 1796, George Washington opted out of seeking a third presidential term. He retired to Mount Vernon, keeping up his daily habit of overseeing the vast estate. Doing so on a stormy and very cold day on December 12, 1799, however, proved his undoing. Returning home late, Washington opted to dine in his wet clothes so as not to disappoint his guests. The next day, he again went out in inclement weather. By evening, the former president felt terribly ill. Various doctors were summoned. Per their orders, Washington gargled with molasses, vinegar, and butter, which choked him. He inhaled steaming vinegar. His throat was swabbed with a mixture that included dried beetles. He was given an enema and drank herbal teas. Nothing helped. Worst of all, the physicians applied bloodletting, wherein the sick man's blood was drained for a bit of time until some 40% of it had been taken. Much weakened by the measure, the sickly Washington was fed up by December 14th. It's reported that he told his doctors, "You better not take any more trouble about me, but let me go off quietly. I cannot last long." They didn't listen and continued applying more useless and even damaging remedies until the first president died later that night. Although scientists have since theorized over what really killed Washington, they have yet to arrive at the true cause of the president's death. Around 10 o'clock on the night of George Washington's death, Martha stood wringing her hands in anxiety at the edge of her husband's bed. Washington feared being buried alive when he issued a final command before he passed, saying, quote, "I am just going." In fact, he is further reported to have said as his last words, "Have me decently buried and do not let my body be put into the vault less than 3 days after I'm dead. Do you understand me? 'Tis well." Martha Washington was so bereaved that she did not attend Washington's funeral. And in the days following, the widow locked up their bedroom, possibly because she was so despondent at her loss that she couldn't bear to stay in the room. Martha then moved her things to a different room on another floor and used it for the rest of her life. Until she died nearly 3 years later, the bedroom Martha shared with George Washington remained locked away from the rest of the world. But the grieving widow did another strange thing too. She burned nearly every letter Washington wrote to her, perhaps hoping to keep her relationship with him private. Today, only 3 letters survive. 2 were found in a desk Martha gave to her granddaughter, and a third which Martha missed in her husband's personal papers. Today, George and Martha Washington lie in a family tomb overlooking the Potomac River at Mount Vernon. But that tomb is not the only one on the property. The couple was originally in an older family mausoleum that included upwards of 25 other family members. The 2 oldest interments were Washington's nieces, Jane and Sarah, who died in 1745. Other nephews and nieces were also laid to rest there, as well as George's half-brother Lawrence and Martha's daughter from her first marriage, Martha Parke Custis. Before his death, Washington noted that the old family tomb was deteriorating enough that he wished to replace it. In his will, he decreed that part of his estate money would be used to build a new tomb where he and the rest of the family were to be reinterred. What is officially referred to as the new tomb was completed by 1831 when the family fulfilled Washington's request. Visitors can still see the old tomb on the grounds, which is just as dank and uninviting inside as one might guess. The new tomb, meanwhile, is gated, but doors are open for guests wishing to peer inside. Not even the caretakers of Mount Vernon can deny that George Washington's ghost continues to wander around his beloved home. President Washington has reportedly been seen on the premises of the estate for a long time. In fact, Josiah Quincy III claims to have seen Washington's spirit as early as 1806 while visiting Mount Vernon, sleeping in the former president's bedroom. During the night, Quincy saw Washington's ghost and surmised that he was angry because the shroud on his coffin was tattered due to relic hunters. It's claimed that the spirit even moves stuff around and speaks to visitors.
I never come in here.
You say that, but sometimes when I come back, everything's kind of been touched and moved, so.
Oh, well, maybe it's a ghost.
Some even say that a dark shadow can be seen in Washington's bedroom. It only seems natural that the bedroom is the biggest draw for seeing Washington's ghost. Over the years, plenty of supposed photographic evidence claims to have captured the ghost of President Washington as he haunts the grounds of his old home. Ghost hunter Rob Guttrow talks on his blog of visiting Mount Vernon and feeling a stabbing pain in his throat in an upstairs bedroom. Minutes later, he said the docent on duty claimed that Washington also had a sharp pain in his throat before he died. Guttrow was standing just outside of Washington's bedroom at the time. Today, Mount Vernon playfully uses some of the ghost stories as a scare tactic to keep visitors from touching artifacts. Apparently, George Washington's spirit is not the only one floating around Mount Vernon. The place is so rife with ghosts, there are accounts of hauntings by various spirits that date back over 100 years. One story, which was reported by New York World in the 1890s, focuses on Washington's bedroom, which still contains the bed he died in. A Mrs. William Beale and her friend were sleeping in the late president's chambers when their candle, situated in the middle of a water basin for safety, began sputtering. Okay, perhaps ghost stories didn't have to be quite as terrifying in the 19th century. The ghosts that haunt Mount Vernon and the stories they generate are almost too many to count. They vary from mild, seeing figures drifting through the mansion, alarms going off at odd hours, hearing the sound of keys being carried, to absolutely bonkers. For instance, there's the visible ghost of former director Colonel Harrison Howell Dodge, who shouted, "What the hell is going on here?" at a docent as a school group passed through. Another time, two security officers patrolling at night watched in horror as a small girl on the path ahead of them suddenly appeared right beside their vehicle. A ghost has also been seen hanging around Washington's tomb, and many visitors and docents alike have been seen moving about and heard songs being sung around the slave memorial. Although some of Washington's belongings were sold after his wife died, some items such as clothing, furniture, tableware, and personal items were kept and returned to Mount Vernon over time. These include, oddly enough, a chamber pot used by the couple in their early years. More curious is a set of George Washington's dentures. It's pretty commonly known that Washington had terrible teeth, losing them one by one until he wore a set of dentures by 1789. And contrary to folklore, they weren't made of wood. The president's chompers are actually made of combined materials that include ivory, metal, and human teeth. They are believed to have been purchased from enslaved or poor people by Washington's dentist in New York. There's more. In 1766, Martha ordered material to make a dozen chair cushions and spent 36 years applying her own needlework to them. 6 of the cushions, which were purchased in 1960, survive. And if one man's trash is another man's treasure, Mount Vernon's old trash pits is a veritable gold mine. An archaeology project known as Mount Vernon Midden lists hundreds of items dug up over time. The artifacts include pieces of pottery and china, but also buttons and beads, buckles, and even a couple of Native American spear points and tools. But the trash pit also dates well beyond the Washington family's time. A 1926 Brownie Scout ring has also been unearthed, as well as a modern Gumby doll. It's hard to believe, but had it not been literally saved from falling apart, Mount Vernon might not stand today. Here's what happened. George and Martha Washington had no children, so Martha left the estate to her husband's nephew, Bushrod Washington. Bushrod also died without children and left the estate to a distant relative. Subsequent owners did little for the place, and by the mid-1800s, Mount Vernon began suffering serious wear and tear. There was no national trust or any other preservation organization to buy it, and the owner at the time, John Augustine Washington III, put Mount Vernon up for sale for $200,000. Enter Louisa Bird Cunningham, who was traveling along the Potomac River one evening in 1853 and happened to notice what bad shape Mount Vernon was in. Cunningham wrote a letter about the situation to her daughter, Anne Pamela Cunningham. Anne Cunningham began writing letters to newspapers asking for help. The letters spread nationwide, spurring a bevy of support for saving the estate. The end result was the purchase of Mount Vernon by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1858, making them the first national historic preservation organization in America. The association still owns Mount Vernon, with 22 board members overseeing its care, and they are always working to continue the preservation efforts of the estate.
So that the next generation that comes in can continue this amazing effort that the Ladies Association started back in 1858.
Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus,
that was interesting. I know that it was built on indigenous land because you can walk through when you're down at the 16-sided barn and you walk back up to the main, not the main level, the mansion house, because that's a drop down. When you're walking through those woods, they'll tell you if you've got a good eye, you could probably find a little arrowhead. I've never found one, and I've never left the trail to go searching because there are snakes around in Virginia, and I'm not a fan of snakes. I got into a fight with a giant anaconda earlier, punched it out. So that was interesting. But I got one more Washington video because it's his birthday, so I'm celebrating. So there's a thanks button. You can donate to the channel. You don't have to. Subscribe, click the bell, and give a thumbs up. Those are the only things I ask. If you've already subscribed, give a thumbs up. Donation strictly if you want to. And until next time, have a good day. Have a good night.